Hi, I'm Philip Walkley, the Executive Director of Service Over Self, and I'm joined on these next few videos by my long-term friend and co-worker, and I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm Big Dog. I've been working with SOS for 18 years as an Assistant Construction Director.
Social justice. It's a term that's been in public discourse a lot lately, and we hear about all kinds of justice. We hear about people demanding justice for a person or a group or a certain situation. A lot of people would label the kind of work that many people do through mission work or mission trips as social justice. So feeding the hungry, caring for the poor, etc. And there's honestly a lot of division even within the church about the term social justice and whether or not it has a place in the Christian worldview. There's some that think the church focuses too much on issues like this and say that it's a distraction from the gospel, and then there are others who say that the church isn't doing enough. Whether you're talking about it or not with students, I know that they are talking about social justice and issues like that in their schools, with their friends, on social media. And so I think we have a responsibility to help students understand what this term means and how it relates to the gospel, or does it relate to the gospel? And there are a lot of definitions of this term or of the word justice in particular, and what people mean when they say things like racial justice or social justice or environmental justice. So I think it's important that we help students understand what this term means from a biblical perspective and how it can actually help inform the way we do gospel-centered mission work. So regardless of how this term is defined in various spheres of our culture, justice is a word and a concept that is both prominent in the Bible and arguably one of the central themes of the Bible. Eric Mason defines biblical justice as the proper execution of God's laws among God's people. Tim Keller talks about the concept of biblical justice like this. He says, "We do justice when we give all human beings their due as creations of God. Doing justice includes not only the righting of wrongs, but of generosity and social concern, especially towards the poor and vulnerable. This kind of life reflects the character of God. It consists of a broad range of activities, from simple, fair, and honest dealings with people in everyday life, to regular, radically generous giving of your time and money, to activism that seeks to end particular forms of injustice, violence, and oppression." Keller also points out that the Hebrew word for righteousness and the Hebrew word for justice are often interchangeable throughout the Old Testament. The Hebrew word most often translated righteousness or being righteous is really more about being just in all of your relationships with God and with others. And so Keller, therefore, says that biblical righteousness is inevitably social because it is about relationships. So, if justice is a central theme in the Bible, then we as followers of Jesus should figure out how to fight for biblical justice in a world wherever we see injustice. And we should help train our students to do the same. And so how do we do that? Well, to help students understand this idea and understand the biblical nature of this term, social justice, I think it's helpful to consider what Eric Mason calls intervening justice in the Bible. This is probably the clearest comparison with what most people mean when they say social justice. And a biblical example of this we see in Isaiah 58, 6 and 7. "Is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood?" We see here in this passage real, tangible, practical, immediate needs being met as an essential part of worshiping God. Again, Eric Mason says, you can't help a person who's experienced injustice and a lack of the basic needs of life without first intervening in their current circumstances, in their current needs. In other words, to do intervening justice, to do biblical justice, we can't just look at a homeless person and say, God loves you, you should get a job. Rather, we must intervene in circumstances and seek to meet any basic needs that they might have. When I think about practicing biblical intervening justice, I can't help but think about my long-term friend and co-worker, Big Dog. Big Dog, not to put you on a pedestal, but you model this so well, and I think part of it is because of your own life experiences, where for many years you really wanted and needed someone to intervene in your own life. And so, can you explain just a little what this looks like practically for you? How have you seen this in your own life, both in the past and now, as you seek to practice this type of justice?
Sure. Can't help but relive some of the experiences of homelessness during my drug addiction, homelessness and stuff. I remember so vividly being hungry and sleeping on the street and wearing ill-fitting clothing. Being the size that I am, the shelters often didn't have my size. And during my 23 years of addiction, I was on and off the street some. I don't have any stories to share with you about people coming to me saying, let me share some food or some properly fitting clothing. Let me give you something to eat. Let me share the gospel with you and intervene in your circumstances and help propel you to an independent, productive lifestyle. I know that the ability was there, but I don't have those stories to share with you about people intervening in my circumstances. So for that reason, once I became sober and a Christian, I sought to intervene in the lives of people who experienced the same kind of circumstances that I did: food, clothing, shelter, housing, education, transportation, those kinds of things. And it's not real hard, and it's nothing new that you need to invent. Think about the basic things that you have and need: food, clothing, shelter, transportation, housing, etc. Seek to provide that for someone who's lacking it. And this would be a great starting point for a relationship that could flourish into something too numerous of possibilities exist for me to expound on them all.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. I know when you have shared that with me in the past, it was heartbreaking to me to hear that you lived for so many years without seeing anyone practice this very biblical concept of intervening in your life, even though there were a lot of people around you who could have done that. And I love seeing you live that out now in the life that you're living now. So encouraging. So what's interesting about this principle as well is that this is also a principle that Jesus modeled for us, right? We don't have to look to Big Dog or others like that for our ultimate example. We can look to Jesus because he modeled this for us on both a micro and a macro level. You see, Jesus got involved in real, practical life circumstances of people, and he calls us to do the same. In fact, Jesus didn't come on the scene making systemic changes at first, though he certainly did through his death and resurrection upended all of the systems of his day. But he started off by meeting real, immediate, and practical needs. There are countless examples of this in the Bible, of Jesus feeding hungry people, of healing the sick, of caring for the vulnerable. And these acts, again, were a part of his message. He didn't do these things just so that people would listen to him share. As I shared in some of my previous videos of the holistic nature of the gospel. And when we do gospel-centered mission work, we learn that we have to proclaim a holistic gospel because that's what Jesus did. We don't just do these intervening justice activities as a nice thing that we do as we preach the gospel, but rather this type of activity, it was a part of the gospel message that Jesus came to proclaim, that God, through Jesus, is reconciling or setting right all things, all that has been broken by sin. And so, intervening justice, as modeled by Jesus, is up close and personal. It's a response to obvious prevailing needs. Lastly, back to Isaiah 58. I love how the prophet is describing behavior that could be classified as social justice by our culture, right? Fighting against injustice and oppression, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless. But in Isaiah, he says that it's actually the type of fasting that God approves. You see, Isaiah 58 is really a rebuke of the church. He's talking to God's people who, according to this passage, are actively seeking God, practicing spiritual disciplines, seeking to live lives of personal piety and righteousness, and yet God says that's not what He desires. Typically, when we think of fasting, when we think of the biblical idea of fasting, we think of voluntarily giving up of necessities, daily necessities or comforts, for the sake of greater devotion to God or to remind us of our need for God. And so I think what Isaiah is saying here is that practicing social justice in this way, practicing intervening biblical justice, is a way to fast. We need to be willing to give up our own comforts, our own necessities for the benefit of others. We don't just meet those needs out of our abundance and out of our excess in a way that's comfortable for us, because fasting hurts. Nobody likes to give up food or deny themselves food. It denies us good and basic things. And so as we practice this intervening justice, we should be willing to sacrifice, to feel loss, all for the sake of meeting the needs of others. And here again, Jesus is our example. Not only did He do this when He walked the earth, like washing His disciples' feet and drying them off with the garment that He was wearing around His waist. That was a costly act of service. But He did it through the cross. His ultimate act of intervening justice, giving up His very life to meet our need for righteousness before a holy God. That is our motivation and model for doing what the world will call social justice. This generation of students is active and wants to be out in the world making a difference. And they're going to be trying to do it whether we coach them to or not. They see all of the hurting and brokenness in our world, and they want to do something about it. And so the question is, are we going to help them embrace a biblical understanding of social justice? Are we going to help them understand how to practice social justice in a way that points to Jesus and that points us to the gospel? My hope is that we will embrace that task in our discipleship of students.